Yeah, it's really exciting to be here. I really enjoyed this workshop, and it was really wonderful to hang out in Cascais. So so I changed the title because I wanted to give more of a science talk rather than an engineering talk. And the question I want to ask is if muscles actually matter for neuroscience. Okay. Um, and I should say that, and why is that relevant for this workshop? Well, this workshop is about agents and embodiment, and that probably for most animals, muscles are some of the most essential piece of their embodiment. Okay. And of course, if we focus on, let's say, the spinal cord, then the answer to this question is obviously yes. But let's say if we model the brain, is the answer also yes? That's somewhat the question of this talk. So let's dig right in. And before, as I start, I want to highlight the people that did the work. This is especially work from Alessandro, Alberto, Axel, Adriana, and also 3 grad students that are still in the lab, Mercurius, Jenkin, and Bianca. And I should also thank the funders, especially SNS. So now the question, so why is musculoskeletal control really hard? And I think this whole workshop has highlighted this already extremely well. Of course, it's very hard because there are lots of muscles and there's a massive coordination problem. How you move is highly redundant. Muscles are multi-articular. They're not just acting on single joints, but they can actually act across multiple joints. And the sensing of your body state is also not, I mean, it's not that you have a fingertip sensor that helps you when you stopped for drunk driving, or not drunk driving, hopefully. But you actually need to integrate lots of information in order to estimate the state of your body. And so that's why motor control is, or sensory motor control is really hard. And me and many others, we're very excited that we can now make progress on this very difficult problem because of parallel advances in AI. And I think this is very nicely highlighted in this diagram that you can see here. So of course, we can do large-scale electrophysiology. And then, and this word came up already nicely, we can build so-called digital twins. And what's fun about these digital twins is we can then take them and clone them and do tons of experiments, find the most interesting experiment, and go back to our monkey or model system of interest and verify that. I'm also highlighting a slightly different loop down here, where our digital twin is perhaps constrained not on physiology, but it's actually constrained on behavior. Okay, first, and then we verify on neural data. And this is actually the approach that I'm going to take for many of the questions. And I'm also highlighting quite a number of works that you've actually seen, even in this workshop, and that are really wonderful works that also follow this very exciting kind of approach. So specifically, the 3 questions I want to ask today are, do better body representations lead to better neural alignment? Okay. Does sensory motor cortex care about muscles? And then lastly, for muscle coordinations, are few muscle synergies enough to do skilled behavior? So let's start with the first question. And of course, we're going to follow this nice diagram that Andreas drew. And when we build our digital twin, what we're going to do is we only use the body. Okay? We only use the body to build our digital twin, and then we ask, does it know more about the brain? And in particular, if you have 2 digital twins and one is better at aligning to the body, then is that one also better at predicting something about the brain? That's kind of the question we're going to ask. And we're initially going to focus only on the sense of proprioception, which obviously is linked to muscles because the most important receptor for proprioception are muscle spindles that sit in muscles. And they sense the length and velocity of the state of muscles and send it up the cortical hierarchy. Here's a picture of muscle spindles. Now, the approach we took in this work that was now published 2 years ago is that we said, well, we can, so presumably, it's an obvious presumably, body and brain co-evolved. So the brain should know something about how muscle spindles are sending the information into the proprioceptive pathway. And if that's true, then what we could do is we could take large-scale motion capture data. We could simulate muscle spindle input at scale. We take neural networks that are trained to integrate that information and that are optimized according to certain hypotheses that we think the proprioceptive system is optimized for. And if our hypothesis about brain and body alignment is true, then we should see some nice generalization, which is to say, only once we've trained a candidate model, then we go and we move our musculoskeletal model. This is a musculoskeletal model, by the way, of a macaque, exactly like the macaque in some experiment in Lee Miller's lab. We extract latent representations at different levels, and we see if they align, if these artificial latent dynamics align with what happens in the QNet nucleus. which is the first brainstem nucleus in the proprioceptive pathway, or with S1, which is the first cortical area in the proprioceptive pathway. So this approach works extremely well, and that's what you can see here. So what you see here is, so this well-known sent-out reach task. The arrows indicate the reach direction of the monkey. The black traces are PSTHs for single trials of the monkey moving this direction. This is QNet nucleus, the brainstem, and red is the prediction of our model. So you can see that the model really captures the neural dynamics. And maybe what is most exciting is that if you look at the 5 o'clock movement, which the monkey moves successfully to 5 o'clock, the kinematics and the posture is slightly different, and our model actually captures different neural dynamics. So from the muscles, it integrates something reasonable to predict this. But now back to the actual question we wanted to ask, and that is there a link between having a better model of the body, which I mean here, the statistics of muscle spindles, and generalizing to neural data? We have actually 6 monkeys in this study, and for all the 6 monkeys, we find a nice correlation between those two things. So here on the x-axis is how well can the model localize the state, as in the position and the velocity of the skeleton from muscle spindle inputs. That's on the x-axis. And on the y-axis, how well does the model generalize to predict neural data in the brain? And every dot is actually a different neural network model. And you can see that if a model is better at localizing the body from spindle inputs, then it generalizes better to neural data. So here we can see, yes, muscles matter even for understanding cortex. Okay? Now, in the interest of time, I skipped a bunch of, there's lots of other results in this paper. We actually tested 16 different hypotheses, and we found for all these different hypotheses, we get this correlation. And another thing that we tested, well, we compared these different hypotheses, and we found that in some sense, the textbook is correct, that estimating the location at the velocity from muscle spindle input is actually the best hypothesis that we found for kind of learning these representations. What was interesting is that it's irrespective of coordinate framework, okay? And then another thing I wanted to highlight very briefly, there are really fun proprioceptive illusions, and these models, these task-driven models, they also are susceptible to these proprioceptive illusions if we test them, which is interesting because they haven't been trained on them. And I also don't have time to explain them, but you can ask about them later. So now, I wanted to talk about muscles, but I've only talked about perception of the states of muscles so far. And in other words, we have been modeling proprioception, but we purposefully isolated the ascending pathway. And the reason why we did this is because, well, the good advantage, then we can rely on simply supervised learning, where we can control the statistics of input and so on, and it's quite nice. And the other advantage that we have in this way is we can do passive muscle modeling and get away with this. When we did this work, we actually used OpenSim, which is relatively slow, and that's why passive muscle modeling was really an advantage, or something we had to rely on. But in the meantime, much faster simulators and muscle models in MuJoCo became available. So now what we can, of course, also do is we can model the full sensorimotor loop. And then what you will have is you will have feedback, you need active muscle properties, and you want to train every single part. Now you want to train the proprioceptive feedback, you want to train the policy, you want to train the efference copy output and so on. But now this was actually very nicely highlighted by Srini. What is a real issue is how do you actually get a model, if you would train this, that behaves like an animal. Out of the box, I don't think right now anyone knows the objective function to get that to work. So the easiest way to do it is to do imitation learning. So you take behavioral data and you align your model to it. And that's still extremely interesting because you can then see, well, what are these representations that emerge in my model, and do they have anything to do with what happens in the brain? So that brings me now to my second question, which is, does sensorimotor cortex care about muscles? Okay. And we stick with monkeys, but now we will look at grasping movements, actually. And we look at grasping because, well, the hand is very complex, also in monkeys. And they, in the specific data that I will look at, they will reach for many different objects. So it's very high entropy kind of problem that they need to solve. And what we build is a teeny tiny whole brain model where we have an object, some visual encoder. There's actually a diffusion model here that creates a trajectory that, based on what the monkey sees, it plans a path. And then this trajectory planner goes into some policy, The policy then controls all the muscles in order to do the task, and the model gets proprioceptive feedback and gets motor efference feedback that feeds back into the decoder. And the name of the game is, of course, we can then do imitation learning, and we can take our sensorimotor control model, and you can compare it to data from Sleeman Ben's Myers lab, where they recorded in S1 and in M1 again. And there's actually a short workshop paper on this and a full paper on bioRxiv that you can find. So now the first thing that I wanted to show you is that we can actually successfully do this. So over time, we can control this hand to grasp arbitrary objects, okay? And I want to highlight something about the experimental design. So these monkeys actually grasped a large number of objects, and we held out some that were not used for task training. And then when we now compare to neural data and do any other comparison, we only use novel objects. Okay? So now first question, are the internal units learned in our model, do they have anything to do with what happens in the monkey's brain? The answer to that question is there's actually quite a number of, I mean, this is linear probing, to be clear, but the latents have something to do with what really happens in the monkey's brain. The color scheme here is, we always use violet for M1 and green for S1. And you can, so in black, this is single trial PSTHs of 2 S1 neurons, and over there of 2 M1 neurons. And you can see that even on OOD objects, this model captures the neural dynamics quite well. In the paper, there's lots of results that I don't have time to go into. For the sake of today, I want to talk about one result that I personally quite like. And the experiment that we did is the following. We said, okay, let's hold our sensorimotor control model fixed, and we imitate exactly the same data set, but we either use muscles or we don't use muscles, okay? And so if we use muscles, we do what I just said. We obviously drive hill-type muscles with muscle activations. And if we have muscles, then we also sense their properties, namely length, velocity, and force, and that's what goes into the proprioceptive system. In the alternative case, what we do is we actually control joint torques, and we sense joint angle, joint velocity, and joint torques. Now, keep in mind that in both cases, because this is a hand, the state inputs and the state and the action space, they're very high dimensional, and almost equally high dimensional in the muscle and in the joint case. So can we do motion imitation in both settings? The answer is yes. And in fact, so this is the average distance between the movement that we want to do on novel objects versus what our model does. We can actually do it much better with joints alone rather than muscles, which makes sense because guess what? Muscles are complex nonlinear devices. But now what is interesting, despite this 30% drop in performance, if you look here, so these are 4 monkeys over here. Sorry for the very busy plot, but importantly, the bar plots in all these 4 monkeys, you can see that we can actually better explain what happens in M1 if we use muscles rather than if we use joints. And in S1, the story is a bit different. There's only 1 monkey where we get significant result, and the other 3, it's equally good. Okay, so seems like M1 really cares about, still operates somehow on muscles. And I do want to very briefly highlight another piece of work that is also an imitation learning from the lab, and is actually from Mercurius Simos, who is here in the room, and where we do imitation learning for locomotion, where we imitate 2 hours of motion capture data in very complex leg musculoskeletal models. And what we then show in the paper is that we can do, for example, we can prompt with text this model to do certain movements. We can say the person turned right, and then the model does that. We can do high-level control where we steer this thing around. And we can also compare to EMG, and what we found is that for quite a number of muscles, this model actually gives quite reasonable EMG activations. That said, to train such a model for, let's say, 80 muscles takes quite a while, and a team of grad students in the lab has very actively worked on making this much faster. So we are able now to train this on GPU accelerated hardware. And now that we are on GPU accelerated hardware, we can obviously train on much more motion capture data, and we can do much more complicated movements. And we've also built combining different biomechanical models full body biomechanical model with 416 muscles and 23 degrees of freedom. So we're quite excited about this, and I think we can do a lot of interesting science with this. But going back to the theme of this talk, are muscles important for neuroscience? I want to ask now the final question, which is, are a few muscle synergies sufficient for skilled behavior? So now when I talk about skilled behavior, I'm not talking about motion imitation. Because obviously, if you want to learn a skill and you imitate an expert in the way that we imitate experts in skilled learning, in imitation learning, then that wouldn't be particularly insightful probably about the skill. But we really want to define a task, and then we just want to learn a controller that maxes out on this task or gets as close as possible to this. This is, of course, something that is very popular in machine learning competitions. And NeurIPS, when this very fast musculoskeletal simulator came up, had a bunch of competitions that were, I guess, designed to motivate the community to jump on this bandwagon, okay? And I'm very proud that many of my grad students have won several of these competitions. So the first 2 years, the very first competition was this task to rotate 2 balls in your hand along a certain trajectory with controlling 39 muscles. And this was won by Alberto, together with Nishit and Pablo, who actually from Alex Bouget's lab. And then the year afterwards, you had to throw some random objects in a bucket. This was won by Alberto and by Alessandro. And then just last fall, there was a competition where you had to kick a ball into a net, I guess. So it's a penalty football. And 3 grad students in the lab won this competition. And here you have more than 100 muscles, and it's really a tricky task. What they did is they built on top of kinesis in order to achieve this. And I want to highlight two things here. Number one, it's just amazing how in the last 3 years, essentially, or 4 years, I mean, these tasks obviously got more complicated, and as a field, we can tackle much, much more complicated tasks. That's really fun. And I also want to highlight that basically all the solutions that people have developed, us or other winning teams, were reliant on curriculum learning. And there's just no one knows, I think, how to win otherwise. Okay, if you do want one insight. Now, if we consider the textbook and we say, well, let's consider this skill here of rotating 2 balls in your hand. How do humans actually solve this task? Then the accepted wisdom is that we simplify the control problem, okay? So a hand is extremely dexterous, has many degrees of freedom, and we don't just use all of them. But in fact, if you, for example, look at the kinematics, so you do motion tracking with your favorite method, and this is a 20-year-old paper, so they used a glove, and indeed they did bowling ball. Then when you look at this data set and you simply do PCA, you realize that, guess what? Very few degrees of freedom are sufficient to explain this behavior. Okay? And this is really a very robust phenomenon in many, many different tasks. Now, we had a policy that at least won this competition, was certainly not as good as humans. So we could ask, well, does it also learn a low-dimensional space? And it did. So here is SDS, our policy. Here's the human. When you actually use exactly the same method as Todorov did and Karfani, our estimate is that, or their estimate was that human use 5 degrees of freedom, and in a control task where you move to arbitrary postures, it's 8.5. And now in our case, our policy also had 5 essentially, and then in control task 8. So it seems to have converged to something very similar. But now, one thing that I'm quite excited about here is, or what I should say first, all these arguments about low-dimensional control spaces is based on reconstruction. No, there's no causality. No one knows if it would work if you project it to a 5-dimensional space. So what is really fun is, because you have a physics engine, you can do what people in cryptography like to call a man-in-the-middle attack. We can just cut through here. And instead of sending the action command that our model wants to send to the musculoskeletal plant, we can perturb it or do various things to it and see if it still works. And in our case, what we do is we span by some muscle synergies, let's say 3 or 4 or 5, a subspace, and then we just project the action into that subspace and we see if it still works. In that way, you can make a plot like this. So if you take all the 39 degrees of freedom, then obviously you have full performance. But now look that unless you reach 15 degrees of freedom, or 15 synergies, or in fact, if you really want to get closer to maximum, you need 25 muscle synergies if you want in order to reach maximum performance. And what I want to highlight here is that signal reconstruction, as we do it for understanding muscle synergies or understanding skilled behavior, is really severely underestimating, presumably, the necessary degrees of freedom. And in the interest of time, I want to maybe very briefly point to a paper where you could criticize this whole result as saying, well, this is a specialist that can only do one thing, and in humans it's different because we're generalists. We don't know how to train generalists like humans yet, but the closest thing is a model called Arnold that has been trained on a number of tasks. And also in this model, we find essentially the same result. So with that, I'm coming to my conclusions. Does better body representations lead to better neural alignment? Yes. Does sensorimotor cortex care about muscles? Yes. Are a few muscle synergies sufficient for skilled behavior? No. And with that, I want to thank the team again, and I'm happy to take your questions.
That was a great talk. You know, I must confess,
yeah,
I'm still skeptical, puzzled, or don't want to believe the result.
Which one?
That that if you have muscles, then you can predict neural activity better. And so I kind of want to try to understand your take on why that is, because does it have to do with we got lucky with the neural network architecture that was chosen, and somehow it happens to be a reasonable match to the biology, or you could imagine any number of other architectures that might have alternative intermediate representations that need not, so how do you think about this?
Yeah, I think to monkey physiologists, this wouldn't be the most surprising result, because
to me too.
Wait, okay.
Surprising.
No, they would think the opposite.
Oh, I see.
M1.
I see.
No, M1 is one. So with extracellular recordings of that type, you're picking up layer 5, quite a few of layer 5 neurons, some of which are spinal projecting motor units. So they probably are pretty close to muscles.
You're saying that that's a relatively linear transform.
Yes.
And so, okay.
Yes. And interestingly, in S1, we don't find that result, right? In S1, it looks like we actually, and that's very
spinal cord doesn't really do anything.
Well, no, I wouldn't say that, but keep in mind.
It's a linear network.
So two things. So it's consistent also with the other work on the proprioceptive system S1, right? But where S1 has abstracted away muscles, it seems like. And I think it's very important to emphasize that this is hand control in a primate, in which case M1 is quite important. Now, if you take
locomotion or something else, where there's
then the accepted thing would be that you can use muscle synergies.
I'll be happy.
And your spinal cord.
Any other questions? Okay, do you mind if we wait for the panel?
Yep. A really cool talk. I had one question about the muscle synergies. Typically they come with like some synergy activations, right? Can you track also in your model how these synergy activations over time correspond to like synergy activations in the muscles of like the humans or the animals?
I'm not sure I follow the question. We can calculate the muscle activation or the synergy activations and then can correlate them to all kind of things. Yes.
The time courses.
Yeah. Yes, and the time courses, for example, they're pretty smooth actually, if that's the question, and they're as you expect in some sense. Yeah.
Last question for the panel.
I was trying to understand this last point about, the mismatch between the number of dimensions of the muscle synergies. So there's a different space, right? You've got you're dealing with joint space on the one hand, is what the motion capture data was from.
Yeah.
and
Oh, yeah.
angle space, joint angle space, and this is muscle activation space. Is that what's going on? Or are you saying that actually the subtle PCs in angle space were also needed for fine control? Those ones that you could have neglected.
Yeah, I think the statement that I'm making here is true for both kind of kinematic space and for muscle space. And indeed, in Todoro's paper, thanks for pointing that out. They obviously don't have muscle activation, and they do the whole analysis in kinematic space. That said, the same result has been documented equally. Now, if you do EMG, you do lots of EMGs, you see that, few EMG patterns are actually sufficient to explain everything. And I think, and I would just say this is a tricky statement because we rely on signal reconstruction theory, and maybe using biomechanical models is a good way to see if that is actually sufficient.
Can I ask one more quick one?
Super quick.
I just was curious. You said for the skilled behavior, you don't want to do imitation learning. I didn't know why.
Oh, so what I mean to say, because we want to learn the skill from scratch, ideally, to understand skill learning, right?
You could have done better by imitating an expert, or no?
Yes, I guess you could. You could do very well, probably with, yeah. You would have to do motion capture data on people doing these kind of tasks. But let's say for the soccer thing, look, it's very interesting, right? Of course, to go and imitate really good penalty takers. But you're studying a different scientific question if you do that rather than, okay, can I train my RL model to beat English goal?